Welcome to video number 3 for Chapter 8, America Secedes from the Empire. Burgoyne's Blundering Invasion. London officials adopted an intricate scheme to capture the Hudson River Valley in 1777. If successful, this would sever New England from the rest of the states and paralyze the American cause. General John Burgoyne would push down Lake Champlain using this route from Canada. General Howe's troops would advance up the Hudson River and meet Burgoyne near Albany. A third force under Colonel Barry St. Leger would come from the west via Lake Ontario and the Mohawk Valley. The British did not reckon with General Arnold, who came along the St. Lawrence to Lake Champlain area, where he assembled a small fleet. His fleet was destroyed, but time had been won. Without Arnold, the British would have recaptured Fort Ticonderoga. If Burgoyne could have started there instead of at Montreal, he would have also been successful. Washington transferred the army after that to the vicinity of Philadelphia. There he was defeated in 2 battles at Brandywine Creek and at Germantown. General Howe settled down in Philadelphia and left Burgoyne to flounder in upper New York. Washington retired to Valley Forge. Trapped, Burgoyne surrendered at Saratoga, New York, to General Horatio Gates on October 17, 1777. Saratoga ranks high among the most decisive battles of both America and world history. This victory revived the faltering colonial cause and, even more importantly, made possible urgently needed foreign aid from France, which in turn helped ensure the American independence. This was the turning point of the American Revolution. France's role in the Revolution was very important. They hoped to regain their former prestige from the loss in the 7 Years' War, which rankled them deeply. America's revolutionaries badly needed help to throw off the British, and they needed to seal an alliance with France against a common foe. American rebels also harbored revolutionary ideas about international affairs. They wanted to end colonialism and mercantilism. They supported free trade and freedom of the seas, and they wanted the rule of law, not raw power, to arbitrate affairs of nations. In the summer of 1776, the Continental Congress drafted a model treaty. This was a guide that commissioners dispatched to France. John Adams, one of the chief authors, describes the basic principles. Number 1, no political connection. Number 2, no military connection. And number 3, this was only to be a commercial connection. These were remarkably self-denying restrictions. This infused idealism into American foreign policy. Benjamin Franklin negotiated the treaty in Paris, and he was determined that his appearance should herald a diplomatic revolution. He shocked the royal court. Ordinary Parisians adored him as a specimen of the new democratic social order. The British now offered a measure allowing American home rule within the empire. This is Benjamin Franklin in his fabled fur cap. He played many roles in his life, as in terms of being a wealthy businessman, a journalist, an inventor, a scientist, a legislator, and a statesman diplomat. He served as an American envoy to France in 1776. This was essentially what colonists had asked for, except independence. On February 6, 1778, France offered a treaty of alliance. The young republic concluded its first entangling military alliance and would soon regret it. The treaty with France constituted an official recognition of American independence, and both bound themselves to secure America's freedom. The colonial war would also become a wider war. England and France came to blows in 1778. The shot fired at Lexington widened into a global conflict. Spain entered in 1779, as did Holland. The weak maritime neutrals of Europe began to demand their rights. Russia's Catherine the Great organized armed neutrality and lined up the remaining European neutrals in an attitude of passive hostility towards Britain. Fighting in Europe and North America, as well as South America, Caribbean, and Asia, ensued. Americans deserve credit for keeping the war going until 1778 with secret French aid. Their independence was not achieved until the conflict became a multi-power world war, too much for Britain to handle. From 1778 to 1783, France provided the rebels with guns, money, equipment, and armed forces. France's entrance forced the British to change their basic strategy. They had counted on blockading the colonial coast and commanding seas. The French now had a powerful fleet in American waters. The British decided to evacuate Philadelphia and concentrate their strength in New York City, and in June of 1778, the Redcoats were attacked by Washington. This battle was indecisive, and Washington remained in the New York area. In 1780, the French army of 6,000 regular troops under Commander Comte de Rochambeau arrived in Newport. French gold and goodwill would help melt suspicions. No real military advantage was yet from the French reinforcements, but by 1780, General Benedict Arnold had turned traitor, and the British had planned to roll up the colonies, starting in the Loyalist South. We'll look at this map in more detail in terms of the flow of the American Revolution in our classroom discussions. Georgia was overrun in 1778 to 1779. Charleston, South Carolina fell in 1780, and warfare intensified in the Carolinas. In 1781, American riflemen wiped out the British at Kings Mountain and then defeated a smaller force at Cowpen, South Carolina. In the Carolina campaign, General Nathaniel Greene distinguished himself by using a strategy of delay. By standing and then retreating, he exhausted his foe, the British General Cornwallis, in vain pursuit. Greene succeeded in clearing most of Georgia and South Carolina of British troops. The battle for the American Revolution took place both on land and on sea. The West was ablaze during the war. Indian allies of England attacked the colonists, and so 1777 was known as a bloody year on the frontier. The two nations of the Iroquois Confederacy, the Oneidas and the Tuscarora, sided with the Americans, but the Senecas, Mohawks, Cayugas, Onondagas joined the British. They were encouraged by Chief Joseph Brant, who believed that a victorious Britain would restrain white expansion west. In 1784, pro-British Iroquois were forced to sign the Treaty of Fort Stanwix, which was the first treaty between the United States and an Indian nation. Under its terms, the Indians ceded most of their land. In Illinois, the British were vulnerable to attack. They held only scattered posts captured from the French. George Rogers Clark conceived the idea of seizing these forts by surprise, so in 1778 to 1779, he quickly captured Kaskaskia, Cahokia, and Vincennes. Clark's admirers have argued his success later forced the British to cede the region north of the Ohio River Valley to the United States at the peace table in Paris. This is a map of George Rogers Clark's campaign, 1778 to 1779. America's infant navy under Scotsman John Paul Jones was a tiny force that had never made a dent in the British's massive fleet. The chief contribution of the infant navy was destroying British merchant shipping, and this carried the war into the waters around the British Isles. Privateers were used as well, and they were privately owned armed ships. Basically, they were legalized pirates. They were authorized by Congress to attack enemy ships. 1,000 American privateers responded to the call of patriotism and profit with about 70,000 men. They captured some 600 British prizes, while the British captured the same number of merchantmen and privateers from the Americans. Privateering was not an unalloyed asset. It diverted manpower from the main war and involved Americans in speculation and graft. Privateering was also good because it brought in urgently needed gold and harassed the enemy. It also raised American morale and ruined British shipping. Shippers and manufacturers were pushing for an end